November 11th, 1918. The guns fall silent along the Western Front. Cold mist hangs over shattered fields where wire, mud, and broken timber stretch to the horizon. Soldiers step cautiously from trenches, unsure whether the silence is real or only another pause before death returns. Church bells begin to ring across Europe, their sound carrying relief, exhaustion, and disbelief. The Great War is over. At least that is what the world wants to believe. But beneath the quiet, something unfinished remains. The war has ended without resolution, without clarity, without reconciliation. Empires have collapsed, borders have dissolved, and tens of millions are dead. Europe stands upright but hollowed, its economies broken, its populations traumatized, its political systems shaken to the core. The peace that follows will not heal these wounds. It will preserve them. To understand what really started the Second World War, one must begin here, not in 1939, but in the unresolved aftermath of 1918. The armistice that ended the fighting did not end the conflict of ideas, interests, and grievances that had produced it. Instead, those forces were compressed, redirected, and institutionalized. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, attempted to impose order on chaos. In doing so, it created a fragile system that depended on compliance without consent. Germany emerged from the war defeated, but not destroyed. Its armies had retreated, not been annihilated. Its territory remained largely intact. Many Germans believed they had been betrayed rather than beaten, a perception reinforced by the sudden collapse of the monarchy and the emergence of a new democratic government struggling to assert legitimacy. The treaty imposed severe territorial losses, military restrictions, and reparations. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war, a clause that carried not only legal weight but moral condemnation. For a nation that had sacrificed millions, this was a humiliation that cut deeply into national identity. At the same time, the treaty attempted to redraw Europe along ethnic and national lines. New states were created, old borders vanished, but the mapmakers could not untangle centuries of mixed populations, historical claims, and economic realities. Minorities were stranded in new countries. Grievances were simply relocated, not resolved. The interwar years became a prolonged struggle to stabilize a world that had lost its balance. In Germany, the Weimar Republic inherited impossible conditions. It was tasked with paying reparations, maintaining order, and building democratic institutions in a society exhausted by war and divided by ideology. Inflation spiraled out of control in the early 1920s, wiping out savings and trust alike. Money lost meaning. Stability felt illusory. For many Germans, democracy became associated not with renewal, but with weakness and humiliation. Yet Germany was not alone in its instability. Across Europe, old certainties collapsed. Austria-Hungary was gone. Russia had descended into revolution and civil war, emerging as the Soviet Union, an ideological experiment that frightened conservative elites and inspired radical movements elsewhere. Italy, despite being on the winning side, felt cheated by the peace settlement, its ambitions unmet. The promise of a peaceful new world order rested on fragile foundations. The 1920s brought moments of recovery, but they were uneven and dependent on international credit. When the global economy collapsed in 1929, the system unraveled with terrifying speed. Banks failed. Trade collapsed. Trade collapsed. Unemployment soared. Democracies faltered under the weight of mass despair. In Germany, the Great Depression was catastrophic. Millions were thrown out of work. While political extremes gained momentum as moderate parties lost credibility. The idea that the post-war order had failed became widespread. People searched for certainty, direction, and meaning. It was in this environment that extremist ideologies flourished. Nationalism hardened into grievance. Economic suffering was interpreted as injustice inflicted from abroad. Conspiracy theories replaced analysis. Violence returned to the streets, normalized as a political tool. Parliamentary compromise came to be seen as paralysis. By the early 1930s, the international system created after the First World War was visibly weakening. Collective security depended on cooperation that no longer existed. Nations turned inward. Fear replaced trust. In Germany, Adolf Hitler rose not as an accident of history, but as a symptom of its failures. He exploited resentment born in 1919, despair magnified by economic collapse, and fear fueled by ideological polarization. His promises were simple: restore pride, reject humiliation, and overturn the post-war order. Many Germans expected renewal without war. They believed revision could occur without catastrophe. They underestimated the consequences of dismantling a fragile peace through force. Elsewhere, the response to aggression was hesitation. The trauma of the First World War weighed heavily on political leaders. War was seen as the ultimate failure, to be avoided at almost any cost. This desire for peace, sincere and widespread, became a vulnerability. Rearmament began quietly. Treaties were tested, then broken. Each violation was met with protest, then acceptance. The cost of enforcement seemed too high. The hope that concessions could satisfy demands persisted. Meanwhile, the sound of industry returned, not for reconstruction but for rearmament. Factories shifted from civilian production to weapons. Trains carried steel, coal and machinery across borders. The hum of manufacturing became the recurring symbol of a world drifting back toward conflict, production lines moving faster than diplomacy. By the late 1930s, the illusion of stability was gone. Alliances hardened. Ideologies clashed openly. The international order built after 1918 no longer restrained ambition, it provoked it. When war came in September 1939, it did not begin something new. It released pressures that had been building for 20 years. World War II was not caused by a single treaty, a single leader, or a single moment. It was the result of unresolved war, unstable peace, economic collapse, ideological extremism, and the failure to confront aggression early and collectively. The silence of November 1918 had been mistaken for peace. In reality, it was an intermission. The machinery of war, once dismantled, had been rebuilt, stronger, faster, and more lethal than before. And when it began to move again, it carried the weight of 2 decades of unfinished history. The years between the wars unfolded not as a straight road toward conflict, but as a slow erosion of restraint. Each crisis chipped away at the belief that the post-First World War order could endure. Each concession taught the same lesson, that treaties without enforcement were suggestions, not limits. In the early 1930s, the international community still spoke the language of peace. Conferences were held. Agreements were signed. Arms were supposed to be limited. Borders were supposed to be respected. But behind these formalities, the reality was changing. Germany withdrew from international disarmament talks in 1933. Rearmament began openly soon after. Conscription returned. The Air Force was rebuilt in defiance of treaties. Each step was justified as correction, not aggression, as restoring balance rather than threatening it. And each step was met with diplomatic protest, followed by inaction. For many Germans, this period felt like recovery. Employment rose as factories reopened. Roads, railways and armaments programs absorbed millions of workers. The economy appeared to stabilize. Pride returned. The humiliation of defeat seemed to fade. What was less visible was the cost. Rearmament was financed through debt and exploitation. Civilian consumption lagged behind military spending. The apparent prosperity was brittle, dependent on expansion and conquest. The system required constant forward motion. This dynamic was not unique to Germany. Across Europe and Asia, states grappled with the same pressures: economic insecurity, political polarization, and fear of decline. In Japan, military leaders argued that access to resources was a matter of survival. In Italy, ambition outpaced capacity. In the Soviet Union, industrialization was driven by the expectation of future war. The world was rearming, not because it wanted war, but because it feared being unprepared for it. The failure of collective security became increasingly apparent. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, international response was limited to condemnation. When Italy attacked Ethiopia in 1935, sanctions were imposed, but they were incomplete and ineffective. Each unpunished act of aggression weakened the credibility of international law. In Europe, the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 marked a decisive turning point. German troops entered territory that treaties had explicitly forbidden them to occupy. The move carried enormous risk. They compared enormous risk, and Hammerloh to Drock the American 40 talk the American 40. German forces had orders to withdraw if confronted, but no confrontation came. For those watching closely, the lesson was unmistakable. The post-war order had lost its will. From that moment on, the pace quickened. Alliances shifted. Military planning accelerated. The belief that war could be avoided through compromise alone began to erode, but not fast enough to stop what followed. The Anschluss with Austria in 1938 was presented as reunification, not conquest. Many welcomed it. Few resisted it. Again, the response from abroad was restrained. The principle of self-determination was invoked, even as it was selectively applied. Later that year, the crisis over Czechoslovakia exposed the final weakness of the interwar system. A democratic state with treaties guaranteeing its borders was dismantled without its consent. The Munich Agreement was hailed as a triumph of peace. It was in fact an admission that the system no longer worked. The expectation among many Europeans was still that war could be avoided. The memory of 1914-1918 remained vivid. Leaders feared not only military defeat, but social collapse. They believed that concessions, however painful, were preferable to another catastrophe. What they underestimated was how deeply the logic of expansion had taken root. By 1939, the machinery of war dominated national priorities. Diplomacy became a tool for buying time rather than resolving conflict. Treaties were tactical instruments. Neutrality was fragile. The world had returned to a condition where power, not principle, shaped outcomes. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 did not shatter peace. It confirmed its absence. The guarantees extended to Poland represented a final line drawn too late. When it was crossed, there was no longer any illusion left to preserve. The Second World War began not because peace failed in 1939, but because it had never been secured in 1919. The recurring sound of the era, the low, constant hum of factories, captures this truth. Assembly lines ran day and night, producing weapons faster than diplomacy could restrain them. Steel, coal, and oil flowed toward preparation, not reconstruction. The world prepared for war even as it spoke of peace. This contrast defined the interwar years. Hope without enforcement, order without power, agreements without trust. What really started the Second World War was not a single decision, but a chain of failures: failure to reconcile victory with justice, failure to stabilize economies, failure to confront aggression early, and failure to recognize that peace requires more than exhaustion. The period from 1918 to 1939 was not an era of peace interrupted by war. It was an unresolved conflict suspended between battles, and when the suspension ended, the violence returned on a scale shaped by everything that had been left undone. As the 1930s drew to a close, the final illusion to collapse was the belief that time itself could prevent war. For 2 decades, delay had been mistaken for strategy. Each year without fighting was taken as proof that catastrophe had been averted. In reality, those years had been used to prepare. The men who marched in 1939 did not step into an unknown future. They carried with them the accumulated weight of unresolved grievances, economic desperation, ideological fear, and institutional failure. Many believed they were correcting history, not repeating it. Soldiers were told they were defending borders, restoring dignity, protecting their people from encirclement and decline. What they expected was a short, decisive conflict that would settle what diplomacy had failed to resolve. What they experienced was something far larger. The international system that collapsed in 1939 had been fragile from its inception because it demanded restraint from societies still traumatized by war, while offering them little security in return. The victors of 1918 sought stability without reconciliation. The defeated sought revision without accountability. Between them lay a global economy that magnified inequality and rewarded extremism. No single nation bore sole responsibility for the collapse, but the system as a whole proved incapable of absorbing shock. The Great Depression was the decisive accelerant. It turned political discontent into mass despair. It stripped democratic governments of legitimacy when they could no longer provide work or stability. It made radical solutions seem reasonable and gradual reform seem pointless. In this environment, ideology became a substitute for policy, and blame replaced analysis. Fear became the dominant currency of international relations. Fear of revolution drove conservative elites to support authoritarian movements, Fear of economic collapse drove populations toward leaders who promised certainty. Fear of war drove democratic governments to avoid confrontation even when it was necessary. Each fear fed the next, creating a cycle that narrowed choices until violence appeared inevitable. The soldiers of 1939 did not march for abstract causes. They marched because the structures that might have prevented war had eroded. They marched because production lines were already running, alliances already hardened, and mobilization timetables already written. The decision for war had been made long before the first shots were fired. The recurring symbol of this era, the steady industrial rhythm of factories, captures the truth more clearly than any speech. Machines did not wait for consensus. They did not debate morality. They produced, and once production reached a certain scale, war ceased to be a question of whether, and became a question of when. American factories, distant from the ruins of Europe, would soon embody a different expression of this industrial power, one oriented not toward revenge or revision, but toward overwhelming capacity. The same mechanisms that had failed to prevent war would later determine its outcome. Looking back, the period from 1918 to 1939 reveals a central lesson. Peace is not the absence of fighting. It is the presence of systems strong enough to manage conflict without violence. When those systems fail, economically, politically, morally, war fills the vacuum. The Second World War did not begin with invasion alone. It began when victory was imposed without reconciliation, when suffering was managed instead of healed, when fear replaced cooperation, and when production outpaced restraint. The bells that rang in 1918 marked the end of one war, but not the end of war itself. They rang over a continent still armed with resentment, still divided by ideology, still governed by institutions too weak to endure crisis. By 1939, the silence that followed those bells had expired, and when the world went to war again, it did so carrying 20 years of unfinished history into a conflict that would finally decide which ideas, which systems, and which societies could survive the modern age. The final understanding of what truly began the Second World War emerges only when the entire arc is viewed without illusion. The conflict was not ignited by a single invasion, nor by one ideology alone. It was born from a failure to reconcile power with responsibility after 1918, and from the inability of nations to recognize that peace requires constant maintenance, not hopeful neglect. The men who governed the interwar world believed exhaustion itself would prevent another catastrophe. They trusted memory to restrain ambition. But memory fades faster than fear, and fear fades faster than hunger. When economies collapse, when institutions weakened, when promises rang hollow, the lessons of the Great War lost their authority. The recurring sound of the age, the hum of factories, continued uninterrupted. Even as diplomats spoke of peace, steel was forged, engines assembled, and weapons refined. Industry did what politics could not. It prepared relentlessly. In the United States, this industrial capacity would later become a symbol of democratic abundance, capable of overwhelming tyranny, not through ideology alone, but through sustained production and coordination. Elsewhere, it became a tool of revision and domination. The tragedy of the interwar years lies in their ambiguity. There was no single moment when war became inevitable. There were only moments when it could still have been prevented, gradually slipping away. Each compromise made sense in isolation. Each delay felt humane. Together, they formed a path that led back to war with greater force than before. By the time the Second World War began, its foundations had been laid across 2 decades of unresolved conflict. The peace of 1919 had demanded obedience without offering stability. The global economy had rewarded risk without providing security. Ideologies had filled the void left by failed institutions, and fear of war, of poverty, of revolution had guided decisions more powerfully than foresight. What really started World War II was not hatred alone, nor ambition alone, nor failure alone, but the convergence of all three in a world unprepared to manage them. It was a war caused by unfinished business, deferred justice, and the mistaken belief that time heals wounds left untreated. In the end, the war would be decided not by those who promised certainty, but by those who could adapt, cooperate, and sustain effort on a scale unmatched in history. Abundance, when paired with democratic coordination, proved stronger than grievance armed with force. The factories that once symbolized the march toward war would become the instruments of its defeat. The lesson of 1918 to 1939 endures because it is uncomfortable. Peace is not secured by treaties alone, nor by victory alone, nor by good intentions alone. It is secured by systems resilient enough to absorb crisis, economies fair enough to sustain trust, and leaders willing to confront danger before it becomes destiny. The silence that followed the guns of 1918 was mistaken for resolution. In truth, it was only a pause, and when the world resumed its march, it did so with the full weight of unresolved history behind it, toward a war that would finally force humanity to confront the cost of ignoring the past.